Hello there and welcome to another episode of World of Tanks with Ungainly Titan. Once again I'm going to talk about lessons of my own career in World of Tanks, mistakes that I made, and tips that I can derive from that to pass on to you that might enable you to avoid making these mistakes. So I'm referring back to my first episode of the tips series. This is going to be in two parts. Basically the initial, and they're not going to be really connected to each other. The initial part is some random stuff that I didn't find out about into the game until quite some time into the game, embarrassingly long into the game on some occasions. And the other part will be more about the kind of stuff that I was talking about in the first two episodes, about the way I played the tanks. One of the first of these things that I didn't know for a long time was the second zoom, just what I'm showing you there. So you pull the left trigger on the Xbox controller and that puts you into this zoom, and then you click the right stick and that puts you into the second zoom. I didn't know about that second zoom until I was, I think, 1,000 games in, maybe, and then I found out about it, and I couldn't reliably trigger it. I couldn't, it was actually one of these things that I had a problem with. And I've discovered on the forums other people had a problem with the notion of the second zoom. So I just thought I'd mention it here. Another thing while I'm mentioning it is that if you right click on the D-pad, it will reload the gun. This usually isn't an issue with most tanks because they're single shot, and you don't want to reload the gun unless you want to change the ammo type. However, with autocannon and auto-loader guns, where you have multiple shot clips, you might want to reload the gun without the clip being completely used, and it's useful to know that if you right click the D-pad you will reload the gun. Apparently not everybody knows that either. So if you go into the game menu, you get a set of tabs that gives you different options. So you can change your controller layout, you can change sensitivities. I just generally work with the default controller layout. Then you have the game options, and here the important ones are aim assist, horizontal stabilization, and whether or not toggling the minimap, and whether or not you want the hull lock on or off on artillery or tank destroyers. Vibration is purely a personal thing. Aim assist is a big one. Aim assist has the potential to considerably affect your game, although I played for about 10,000 or 11,000 games with aim assist on. And I've played for another 11,000 games or so with aim assist off. I think I've done better with aim assist off. But I have so many other variables in terms of my internet quality and stuff like that I'm not 100% sure of how much difference aim assist made. I just played 2 proving ground games with aim assist on and off, and to be honest with you, I didn't immediately notice. What it's supposed to do is that it's supposed to keep the gun pointed towards the centre of mass of a tank that you're currently targeting, but it's off if you're in sniper mode. So it's kind of if you're dogfighting or you're maybe fighting at a corner or peek-a-booming, but you don't want to go into full sniper mode because it would cut down your vision range. It's my experience of it is that I think the consensus on the forums is that it makes sniping weak spots more difficult, because if the enemy tank moves, the gun automatically tries to track towards the centre of mass of that gun, which could be behind cover, or it isn't where you want the gun to be pointed, so it makes that kind of fighting more difficult. But it's fairly specific, and some people want it on, but it's on as far as I know by default, but I would be inclined to turn it off. I do feel that I did better with it off, that I was doing more damage per battle, should we say. Horizontal stabilization is one you want on. It wasn't in there in the original part of the game, it's something they brought in later on. I really noticed it when it came on. Basically, horizontal stabilization keeps your gun pointing when you're in sniper mode, or any mode really, in the direction the camera's in. So that if you move the hull of the tank and you're in sniper mode, the tank continues to point at the target you were aiming at. Needless to say, this is very useful. Hull lock, I prefer it on TDs and off in artillery, but that's purely personal preference, and other people have different preferences. I would recommend that especially if you're beginning the game, that the minimap is toggled on. This is less of a thing than before, where you couldn't change it in the game, but now that you can change it in the game, it's not as important. But I think that if you're learning the game, it's more important to have the minimap on, because it gives you a greater overall view of the game. That said, some of the top players play with the minimap off and play with the compass rose instead. Whatever works for you, I wouldn't be too dogmatic about it, but this is my feeling. I would recommend that you play with the square minimap. I should point out that aim assist is not the same, or has nothing to do with the auto aim function, where you press right bumper and the gun locks onto the nearby target, like I'm doing there, to snapshot across the thing. Auto aim is quite useful. It allows you to make snapshots. It does have the disadvantage of pointing towards the center of mass. And another useful thing is when you're peeking out behind rocks like that, or ridge lines, is that you can use the auto aim to determine that you have a line of sight to the target before you fire. And sometimes it's very helpful to use if you know you're in cover and can stay in cover and concealed, you use auto aim to determine if you have a line of sight, and then you zoom in and aim manually to hit a precise location rather than the center of mass that the auto aim is pointing at, like I just there. Going back to episode 1 of this series, I pointed out that the first episode I talked about silver earning and my mistake of playing too many tanks at once, and the negative effect it had on silver earning, partly by overbuying tanks, but also because I was playing tanks that were undertrained, that I myself were not sufficiently familiar with. Now, if you don't have a problem with consistency playing different types of tanks, and you are playing, say, all your tanks or majority of your tanks every session to get the daily doubles, but that your score and your performance is good, then that's fine. You don't have a problem with it. However, I had a problem with it, and I think a lot of other people do. And one of the things I find is that it's better to play one particular tank primarily in a session, so that you build up a lot of games with that tank. And the lessons, should we say, the mistakes you make in that tank stick with you more. Another thing I've noticed is that, or I find very useful, is that if you're on a console, the Xbox One or the PS4, you have a game DVR function. And every time you die, in particularly if you die when something unexpectedly, a tank attacks you from behind, a flank has collapsed that you thought was safe, or that you're shot at from a long range by a person in a location that you thought your team was dominant in. That's indicating a lack of situational awareness on your part. You had become so engrossed in the immediate fight that you had lost the overall picture, and recording the 5 minutes prior to your demise and reviewing it, and watching in particular the minimap, which is another reason I think to go for the square minimap, but watching in particular the minimap and developments on the minimap in the period leading up to your demise can be very helpful in giving you the warning signs of stuff going wrong elsewhere in the game, and is a very useful tool for analysing your game in the absence of an actual replay system. On the off chance that you're quite early in your gaming career and you're watching this series, what line of tanks is the best line for newbies to play? In that case, my recommendation would be for Russian heavies. I think the Russian heavy line is a very good line of tanks to learn to play tanks on, starting with the KV1 and working your way up. The IS line is probably easier than the KV line. That is, the KV1, KV3, KV4 are quite challenging tanks to play. But the IS line are relatively straightforward tanks to play, and you will learn quite a lot about the use of armour, the use of cover and stuff like that. And they are tanks that are forgiving of mistakes. If you don't want to play the Soviet line, then the US heavy tank line is actually, I would recommend, next. The US heavy tank line tends to be it has a kind of a theme. Basically, the US heavy tanks, like when we're shooting above here, have pretty thrash side armor. Their front armor is usually quite good. Now, the lower front plate is usually weak, but the lower front plate is usually weak in most tanks. And the lower front plate is usually easy to cover by terrain. But the sides of the American tanks tend to be weak, and their strength is they have very strong turret fronts. Frequently strong turret sides as well. But they have very strong turret fronts, and this allows them to find terrain where they can keep the hull of their tank beneath the terrain. There's just the turret sticking out, and the guns are quite accurate. They're reasonably good rates of fire and reasonably good DPM. Soviet tanks tend to be high alpha damage, actually fairly slow rates of fire and fairly high in accuracy. A bit eccentric on the Soviet side. So, but I think the Soviet tanks, like I said, they're well armoured and they're forgiving of mistakes in ways that very few other tanks are. I haven't played the German tanks to a great extent, but I have played the Hammer, which is a Tiger variant. And I find the German tanks, well, they're theoretically very well armoured, and historically, of course, they were quite beast mode in their day. But the thing is, Tiger got his reputation facing T-34s. The Tiger's the T7, the T-34 that it was facing is a Tier 5. Tier KV-1s, which are also Tier 5s. So essentially they were facing Tier 5s. On the western side, the Tigers were facing M4 Shermans, in places like Italy at any rate, and in North Africa, M4 Shermans, which are again Tier 5s. The Tier 6, the Easy 8s, and the Sherman Fireflies, and the Jumbo Shermans were upgrades to the Sherman line specifically to counter engagements with Tigers, and some of the gun-up enhancements were actually to, again, penetrate the Tiger at the front of Tigers. So, the Tiger, while it has the reputation and deserves the reputation, the other thing about the Tiger, of course, was the Allies, particularly in the Western Allies, didn't actually meet that many Tigers. The Russians met a lot more, but there weren't actually all that many Tigers built in comparison to the total number of tanks floating around Europe in World War II. So the Tiger, yeah, it's a good tank, but it requires a bit of knowledge of the game to make the most of the Tiger tank. And as far as I can make, well, I've already started with the DB2 at this stage in the Germans, and it has very good armour, and the gun is absolutely crap. So I suspect the Germans are a bit more problematic, and the British are. I wouldn't recommend the British heavies to a new player, mostly because the British heavies are dreadfully slow. They have the same problems with armour as the German tanks, in the sense that while they are well armoured in theory, the armour is quite flat, and they're very slow. So it's very hard to get British tanks into a position where they're effective early in the game. So my recommendation is, if you are looking for a tank line to learn your trade on, Soviet heavy tanks or American heavy tanks would be my recommendation. Light tanks are hard to play, but once you learn to play them, they are very, very rewarding. And it is well worthwhile. Tank destroyers, variable. You have the heavily armoured behemoths, which are slightly easier to play. They're closer in some ways to heavy tanks than they are to tank destroyers. And then you have lightly armoured, very stealthy tanks that depend really on, again, they tend to be fast, they tend to be fairly stealthy. So you can have great games with them, but it requires, again, a bit of knowledge of the game mechanics and map knowledge to play them at their most effective. Artillery is a completely separate game entirely. It can be useful, it can be fun. A lot of people don't like it, of course, because they feel it shouldn't be in the game, and there is an argument to be said that it shouldn't but wargaming have included artillery. People have been whining about it on the PC since its inception. Similarly, on the Xbox, there's no sign of wargaming removing it, so my view is that artillery is here to stay. Again, I would reiterate my point: if you're going to learn to play tanks, go for the heavies. But what about medium tanks? Medium tanks are probably the hardest of all to play. They're the most rewarding, I think, when played well, and a lot of the top players prefer medium tanks to everything else. 2 points about medium tanks: most of the medium tank lines require that you go through light tanks to get at them. I think the exception is the Americans, where you can go through the M3 Lee into the Shermans. The M3 Lee it's an experience. It's an awful experience. Probably can be played as a reasonable tank destroyer by a very good player or an experienced player, but it is not something I'd recommend. But the thing is that other than that, you're really going through light tanks than to get to medium tanks. And the thing about medium tanks is that they have the ability to do pretty much everything, but they don't do it as well as any of the specialized tanks. So learning to use medium tanks in all the situations that they can be used in is kind of the mastery of the game. If you can master the various aspects of the game, you're ready for medium tanks. And if you master medium tanks, you pretty much have mastered the game. So that's my brief kind of take on that stuff. My own thing was that, after I realized what I was doing wrong and that I needed to learn specific aspects of tanking, like angling armor, bouncing shots, the use of cover, I went for the Russian heavies, and I learned quite a lot playing Russian heavies, and I think you would too. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you again soon.